Hi everyone, David Fazzino here, and in this screencast I'm going to discuss militarization and particularly in the context of militarization in its variety of forms throughout the globe, including Arctic regions, where we see an increase and indeed globalization of militarization. We'll also discuss military technologies as well as military impacts on society as a whole. And overall, some of the larger questions to think about as we go through the screencast has been what has been the extent of the military in various aspects of life, not only for those that have been in the military and their subsequent civilian lives afterwards, but throughout society as a whole. And in that context, how has society been organized around military ideals? So we will begin with a broad discussion at the state level of the extent of military spending. From there, we'll go into ethnographic examples, that is the work of anthropologists in a variety of cultural contexts, starting in the United States and ending in the United States as well, with Lutz's work looking at militarization and its impacts more broadly, particularly in one community with a military base. Kajihiro's work in Hawaii. From there, we'll extend this into Ethiopia with the militarization or villagization and resettlement in Ethiopia. Hawkins's work, somebody from within the military talking about the military as a greedy institution. Ben-Ari and Frühstück's work on the live fire exercise in Japan. Pauline Lippmann's work in militarism and education, particularly in the United States, and Sita Lowe's discussion of militarization and public spaces overall. So to frame the issue, we can see here in the United States, again, a lot of these ethnographic examples are in the United States, and we have quite a bit that's spent within the United States, 38% in fact of the world share. And so, if you look at the numbers here, we get to almost all these other countries in the top 10, just equaling what is spent in the United States. So 801 billion US dollars. This is all 2021 data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, published in April of 2022. Interestingly enough, although the United States has the largest percentage of world share as well as the amount spent with 38% and $801 billion spent in 2021, it is not the largest in terms of share spending in terms of share of GDP. That designation belongs to Saudi Arabia at 7.7% of the GDP. And if you want to see more information on this, on the course page, there is the report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which goes through the top 40 countries in terms of amounts spent. But those countries aren't necessarily the ones that have, as we see here in this column on GDP, gross domestic product, the highest spent overall in terms of relation to gross domestic product. So delving into the first ethnographic example, and Catherine Lutz is writing about particularly impacts of military in the town that she lives and works in, and this is a 2002 piece, and frames it in the broader context of militarization in the United States overall. Defining militarization, drawing from a number of different sources, as the contradictory, intense social process in which civil society organizes itself for the production of violence. This involves intensification of labor and resources allocated to military purposes, including shaping of other institutions in synchrony with military goals. And we'll see particularly how this plays out in the educational context that Pauline Lippmann talks about, and we'll look at that later on in this screencast. The idea that war is pervasive cross-culturally was espoused by numerous commentators, and we see this indeed in much of the archaeological record. Oliver Wendell Holmes, former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, noted, "So long as man dwells upon the globe, his destiny is to battle. War's message is divine." From within the military complex as well, there has been critique of this in terms of how resources are being allocated in the United States. So General Eisenhower, when asked about the mushrooming military budget, had responded that it would leave the nation a militarized husk hardly worth defending. That is, so many resources were being spent on the military that it didn't leave much in terms of public funding, redistribution of tax dollars to other necessary public spending, education, infrastructure, these sorts of things, healthcare, research, these sorts of things. Lutz looks at the broader context of the United States from its inception and notes that it's a nation that has been made by war. Of course, the long history of war, the genocidal practices against Native Americans, ethnocidal practices as well, the whole idea of the boarding schools trying to supposedly re-educate Native Americans to adopt Western white European lifestyles, American lifestyles. Also, we see this with the impact globally in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and the importation of labor to feed basically the growth of agriculture and industry in the United States. And so there's quite a bit of hierarchy that's embedded within this, and we talked about this in our context of earlier lectures in the class on social inequality. Lutz notes 3 time periods of acceleration and militarization in the United States, with the fascist forces in 1939, the national security state in 1947, and the September 11th attacks of 2001. And the YouTube video that is on the course Bolt page highlights for you how this military spending has been quite dynamic over time, and I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. So anthropologists also write from within the military, and an example of this is Hawkins's work in Ben-Ari's 2004 piece, The Militarization in the United States. And Hawkins notes that there's essentially a micromanagement of every aspect of life. So it extends into the family. There's these family readiness groups whose hierarchy very closely follows the hierarchy in the military itself. And so there's this idea for Hawkins, as he's writing about the experience, that the military is a greedy institution, that it wants more and more from not only those who are active military, but also their families as well. And as Hawkins notes, military realities, like all realities, are socially constructed and interpreted. That is, there's a particular lens through which the world is seen. And the military is a unique institution. It's a total institution, again, to remake individuals to suit particular purposes within that organization or structure. And Hawkins talks about how that impacts family life as well. In the context of Hawaii, Kajihiro's 2000 piece in Cultural Survival Quarterly, Nation Under the Gun, Militarism and Resistance in Hawaii, first discusses the history of the U.S. military in Hawaii with the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893. Hawaii is a key strategic location, what Bellow calls a transnational garrison state in the Asia-Pacific area. Of course, we have the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese that entered the U.S. into the war in the Pacific, and this has, of course, shaped a lot of policy over the long term. For example, the United States in Guam, United States presence in Guam, as well as the Compact of Free Association with a number of countries, independent countries, including the Federated States of Micronesia, where I do some of my work. And so Kajihiro's piece, it's historical, but it's still relevant today, noting that the high percentage of active military. Numbers are anywhere between 11 and 20%, depending on the island. And of course, in particular regions of Oahu in particular, even more based on the military bases that are present. So much greater percentage of the population in some areas. Large percentage of the land is also military, and this includes sites which are important to Native Hawaiians religiously for subsistence as well. Oahu has the largest concentration with 22.4% of the land being allocated to the military. And some of the issue here is that the military uses of land conflict with fundamental Hawaiian values, this idea of aina, this idea of caring for the land, love of the land. So this would be things like bombing ranges, unexploded ordnances, and then Superfund sites where toxic wastes are stored and or seeping into the environment, into the water and the soil as well. So some of the land is still contested. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920 set aside 187,000 acres for native homesteading. A 1983 federal state task force concluded that 13,580 acres had been improperly withdrawn by presidential executive orders. Tajihiro, much like Catherine Lutz, talks about this idea of economic dependency on military expenditures. So heavy reliance here in terms of a number of businesses, the economy as a whole as well. For those within as well as outside the Hawaiian sovereignty movement and the various iterations of that, there are calls for the military to disclose all pertinent environmental, economic, and social data to assess the true impacts of its presence. Of course, this has to be weighed against this idea of secrecy in the context of governance as well. Moving internationally, Steingraber's 1987 piece looks at the efforts of resettlement and villagization as tools of militarization in southwest Ethiopia. These have been employed in a variety of military settings or military strategy in Vietnam, Guatemala, and Cambodia. And Steingraber talks a little bit about that history in the brief article. In 1984-1985, there was a famine in Ethiopia, and this, along with ecological arguments, led to plans to attempt to move essentially 33 to 37 million people by the 1990s in order to make better use of resources. So we can see here, going back to our earlier discussion in the class along the lines of population and its impacts, and how utilitarian arguments for population management can serve basically to further marginalize those that are socially marginalized to begin with. Villagization and resettlement were engineered to contain rural armed opposition as well as increase military control of southwestern Ethiopia. Resettlement and villagization were tools for militarization in both senses of the term. According to Steingraber, first, they imbued the societies they create with military characteristics, which includes a regimentation of labor, top-down decision-making, compulsory participation under threat of corporal punishment, surveillance, and curfews. And of course, we can see this in other contexts as well. For example, the treatment of Native Americans in the United States in terms of compulsory participation, particularly in context of things like boarding schools. Second, the newly created communities are themselves used as military infrastructures and provide recruits for the Army, as well as special militia forces responsible for locating and punishing suspected rebel collaborators. Most of these refugees describe villagization as the last in a series of repressive measures designed to weaken their resistance to government control overall. In Benary and Frustuk's piece on the live fire exercise in Japan, these are done the first weekend of September by the Japanese self-defense forces. Benary and Frustuk note this is a cultural performance, that is, occasions in which culture or society reflects on and defines itself, dramatizes its collective myths and history, and presents itself with alternatives. So Benary and Frustuk in their analysis think about the context of this in terms of the drills, and these are, of course, to illustrate the assumed effectiveness of the military to the civilian population of the Japanese themselves, as well as potentially threatening to outsiders in terms of these coordinated live fire exercises. The idea of a uniform, embodying this idea of danger, style, and beauty, and then this is overall this visibly pleasing, almost choreographed display of visual violence. And this becomes, in the context of live fire exercises, violence becomes an object of fascination, enjoyment, as well as celebration.